wind that swept through the Red Keep on the darkest night of Rhaenys Targaryen's short life seemed to howl with the laments of all the dead. Outside the fortress, the sack of King's Landing raged, a conflagration of cruelty and chaos that would mark the end of House Targaryen's centuries-long reign. At just 3 years of age, Rhaenys knew nothing of the politics or the battles that had sealed her family's fate. She only knew that her mother, Princess Elia Martell, had told her to hide beneath the bed and stay very still. From her vantage point, clutching a small stuffed dragon in her tiny hand, she saw boots marching on the stone floor, saw shadows dancing wildly against torch-lit walls, heard screams that curdled her blood. Some voices were so close that every hiss of steel made her heart leap. There was a shriek, then another, and then footsteps. In the confusion of that night, in the swirl of Lannister crimson and the pale gold of their lions, no one spared a glance for a little girl huddling in the darkness. The day after, she would learn her mother had been killed, and her baby brother Aegon murdered. But on that gruesome night, fortune, if one could call it that, came in the form of Varys, the Master of Whisperers. The Spider, as he was so often called, arrived in a swirl of soft slippers and hushed urgency, his face drawn tight with something akin to pity. He had found her, Rhaenys Targaryen, the half-Dornish princess whose father was Rhaegar, the last dragon prince. He had pressed a small cloth to her mouth to muffle her sobs, scooped her up with a gentleness she would never forget, and spirited her away through the labyrinth of secret passages beneath the Red Keep. Even as a child, she sensed the dread in him. Varys, robed in drab, unassuming attire, had always borne an uncanny ability to slither about undetected. But now his composure seemed shaken. The pungent smell of smoke seeped through every crack in the walls. Distant roars of flames threatened to devour the city above them, and through hidden corridors, Rhaenys could hear the clash of steel and the triumphant bellowing of soldiers loyal to House Lannister. Soldiers rewarded for their treachery with permission to loot, to pillage, to destroy. There were hurried steps and whispers in the darkness. Rhaenys clung to Varys' robes, too numb even to cry. For hours, it seemed, they descended deeper and deeper into the bowels of the castle, through damp tunnels and ancient corridors lit only by the flickering lantern Varys held in his trembling hand. Eventually, a small rowboat met them at the edge of a waterway that led out to the Blackwater Rush. Dressed in nothing but her night clothes, Rhaenys slipped into the boat, guided by the Master of Whisperers. He rowed with silent, desperate strokes, and she recalled how the moonlight shone on the water like shards of shattered silver. By the time dawn broke over the horizon, they were leagues from the Red Keep. The city behind them no longer looked like King's Landing, but a smoking ruin. Torn sails and broken masts in the bay spoke of escape attempts ended in tragedy. The air still carried the tang of salt and blood. Some claim war can birth new dynasties, new hopes, but all Rhaenys felt that morning was despair. She had no inkling that she was now considered dead by almost everyone who cared and hated her. Her survival was a secret so closely kept that it would shape the future of the Seven Kingdoms in ways no one could yet imagine. Varys took her to a ship waiting further down the coast, a Bravo Sea merchant vessel with black sails trimmed in purple. No Lannister banners, no familiar faces, just a group of somber men and women who spoke with thick accents. They pledged themselves to gold, not to any house or any cause, and Varys, ever the Spider, had spun enough webs of coin and promises to secure this passage. He gave the Braavosi captain stern instructions. The child was to be cared for in Pentos until he could come with further arrangements. She was precious cargo, though he gave no name or explanation. In times of war, coins spoke louder than truth, and the captain accepted without question. Rhaenys' life from that point on became a quiet tapestry of veiled identities and shapeless fears. Once in Pentos, she was placed in the care of a matronly woman named Asaria, who spoke limited common tongue and fussed over the girl endlessly. She told everyone who asked that Rhaenys was her niece, a child orphaned by raiders, and that was why her hair was dark and her eyes so wary. The folk in the modest household took little notice, for refugees poured into Pentos from all over, especially in the aftermath of Robert's rebellion. Rhaenys was simply another orphan of war, one more child lost to the chaos that engulfed the Seven Kingdoms. On some nights, though, Varys would appear. He had his ways of moving quietly even across the narrow sea. He would arrive with letters, small gifts, and occasional trinkets of dragon lore. He never told her outright who she was, but he would drop hints. He would teach her to read from dusty tomes in the common tongue. He would tell her about Aegon the Conqueror, his sisters Visenya and Rhaenys, and how they brought all the realms under the Iron Throne. She remembered him once pressing a small dragon figurine into her hand and murmuring, "Remember your blood, child. It is more precious than gold." At times, Rhaenys would ask about her mother or father. Varys would only say that they had been noble, beautiful, and lost too soon. She gleaned bits and pieces. Her father was a prince who loved music and prophecy. Her mother was a princess of Dorne who carried the sun's fire in her veins. She did not know at that age that King's Landing believed her bones lay in a grave beside her infant brothers. She did not know she had survived one of the most infamous massacres in Westerosi history. Years slipped by as she grew. Her hair darkened to a deep brown with a hint of Targaryen silver when caught by the sun at just the right angle. Her skin remained sun-kissed, a testament to her Dornish heritage. She was taught letters, sums, the languages of Essos, and bits of history from a rotating cast of tutors Varys hired in secret. Every so often, the Master of Whisperers would vanish for months. Asteria tried to keep Rhaenys' routine stable. Chores in the small courtyard, lessons in the morning, reciting from old scrolls by candlelight. Yet, in the quiet hours of the evening, Rhaenys' mind would wander. She would recall the faint recollections of that terrible night, see flashes of red and gold cloaks, hear the echoes of her mother's screams. Sometimes she dreamt of dragons flying over the Red Keep, raining fire down upon an army of lions. She would wake trembling, uncertain what it all meant. By the time she was 10, a black-haired boy about her age arrived in Asteria's household. He called himself Young Griff, but Rhaenys saw the faint glimmer of recognition in Varys' eyes when the boy arrived. Over time, she came to learn that he was Aegon Targaryen. Her brother, also thought dead in King's Landing, but smuggled out. The revelation shattered her. She had grown up believing she was alone. Now here he was, fair of face, with violet eyes that seemed so out of place against his dyed blue hair. He called her sister, though with a shyness that spoke volumes. They had grown up worlds apart, each in hiding, each burdened by secrets they could scarcely comprehend. Varys, who orchestrated this meeting, introduced them carefully, as if they were pieces on a Sivas board that must not topple prematurely. They swore to keep their parentage hidden, to call each other by simple names, Rhaena and Griff. Yet in their hearts, they knew they were Targaryens, dragons who had lost their kingdom but not their birthright. As the pair grew older, so did their curiosity and their hunger for the truth. While Aegon's education was overseen by Jon Connington, Rhaegar's on-time friend and loyalist, Rhaenys' upbringing was less martial and more subtle. Varys made sure she learned the arts of court intrigue, diplomacy, and reading people's words as well as their faces. She was taught to speak Bravosi, Pentoshi, and enough Myrish to bargain in those tongues if needed. Though rarely allowed to handle weapons, she sometimes trained in secret, with a short blade, practicing thrusts and parries in the hidden courtyard behind Asteria's modest estate. She was lithe, quick, with a quiet grace that seemed to come naturally. She found she had a talent for climbing rooftops and eavesdropping outside windows, gleaning secrets. It amused her to learn she had some part of Varys' cunning, or so he teased. Meanwhile, Robert Baratheon sat the Iron Throne in King's Landing. The realm was at peace, but whispers circulated. The Mad King's last heirs might still live. The rumors named the exiled Viserys and his newborn sister Daenerys, who had fled to Braavos. There was never once talk of Rhaenys or Aegon having survived. Most believed they perished. It was a falsehood that shielded the pair from Robert's wrath, which persisted for any Targaryen he could find. Rhaenys followed these rumors like a cat follows a shifting shadow. Her father's siblings, her aunt and uncle, had once been exiled too. But in truth, neither Rhaenys nor Aegon had any contact with Viserys or Daenerys. Each offshoot of House Targaryen existed in its own precarious bubble, scattered by fate. At 14, Rhaenys had grown into a confident young woman, tall, with a slender build, and fierce dark eyes that reflected her Dornish heritage. One late evening, Varys came to her with a sealed scroll. His voice was solemn as he explained that Doran Martell and Sunspear was quietly searching for news. Oberyn Martell, the Red Viper, had never forgiven the Lannisters for what they did to his sister Elia and her children. House Martell seethed with unquenched thirst for vengeance. A hint of hope had flickered in Dorne's encrypted letters. If by some miracle Elia's children survived, they would find all of Dorne at their backs. Varys warned Rhaenys to be cautious, for Dorne was cunning in its own right. But for the first time, Rhaenys realized she had powerful kin who would not hesitate to help reclaim what had been stolen from her bloodline. She became restless. It was no longer enough to watch from afar while Robert Baratheon, a usurper in her eyes, sat on the throne that should have been Rhaegar's and, by extension, hers and Aegon's. She felt the stirrings of anger, a righteous indignation that simmered whenever she read about her mother's murder, about her father's name dragged through the mud as if he were the villain. She knew well enough that Rhaegar had made mistakes. He had left King's Landing defenseless, chasing after prophecies and destiny. But the savage butchery of Elia and her children was unforgivable. It gnawed at her that these Lannisters who carried out the deed faced no justice. Jon Connington, aware of her frustrations, agreed to train her in earnest. He taught her strategy, led her through battlefield histories, and gave her lessons on the nature of loyalty and ambition. Over time, she learned of the Golden Company, the famed sellsword army founded by exiled Blackfires. The irony did not escape her that the progeny of a Targaryen bastard line could become her greatest ally in retaking the Seven Kingdoms. Connington spoke of allies within Westeros, lords and ladies dissatisfied with Robert's rule. Whispers claimed that the crown coffers were running dry under the rule of King Robert, who seemed more interested in hunting and feasting than governance. The Lannisters had grown more powerful. Some great houses muttered privately that a Baratheon Lannister monarchy might not last. If a rightful Targaryen claimant appeared at the right moment, with the right alliances, the realm could shift once again. For Rhaenys, that possibility became a driving force. She spent her nights poring over maps of Westeros, memorizing the major roads, the castles, the allegiances of each region. She studied her father's final campaign, the battles fought during Robert's rebellion, the tragedies at the Trident and the sack of King's Landing. She wanted to learn from these mistakes. Where Rhaegar had been driven by prophecy and romance, she intended to be guided by pragmatism. When she looked at her brother Aegon, she saw a boy of pride and determination, one who believed deeply in his own right to rule. But she also saw his insecurities, his uncertainties. He had never set foot in the land he claimed by birth. Together, they reassured each other that the day would come when they would stand on Westerosi shores with an army behind them. Around her 15th name day, Rhaenys began to sense that Varys was preparing something far greater than mere survival. He spoke in half-riddles about seeds, sown across the Seven Kingdoms, contacts in the Crownlands, in the Reach, in the Riverlands. He told her that the small folk still whispered tales of the Dragon Princes, that some houses bore silent resentment against the Lannisters. She asked him, "Why do you do this? What is your gain?" He gave her a tight-lipped smile and answered, "I serve the realm. A strong, just ruler serves the realm best." She caught the flicker of sadness in his eyes. He had seen too much blood, too many innocents cast aside. Perhaps, she mused, Varys saw in her and Aegon a chance to restore something better. But war is never simple, nor is the path to a throne. Tensions boiled in Essos. The Golden Company's captains debated whether to support the exiled Targaryens in their attempt to reclaim the Iron Throne. Viserys Targaryen, across the sea, declared himself the rightful king, the third of his name, though few truly believed in his cause. He had married his sister Daenerys to a Dothraki Khal, or so the rumors said, and Rhaenys felt a pang of pity and unease for a girl she had never met. She and Aegon had been raised in secret but with a plan, a structure, an array of mentors. Viserys and Daenerys had been on the run with far fewer allies. Rhaenys did not relish the thought of conflict with her father's siblings, but from all that she learned, Viserys was ill-equipped to unite Westeros. And so began a delicate dance of letters. Messages were sent in code to Dorne, to Starfall, to the houses of the Reach with old grudges, to the Iron Islands where ambition might be bought with promise of plunder. Nothing was certain, and each missive carried terrible risk. Bit by bit, a plan took shape. Connington was convinced the Golden Company would sail for Westeros if the Martells pledged their support. Varys whispered of certain crownland lords who longed for the return of Targaryen rule, houses that had lost everything in Robert's rebellion and received no recompense. Allies in Lys and Tyrosh might lend ships for the crossing, if the price was right. At the heart of it all, Rhaenys prepared herself for a role she had never been born to play. Queen, not just a princess. She remembered the stories of her father's sister, the original Rhaenys from the Conquest, who had wielded power in her own right. She was not content to stand behind Aegon as a silent supporter. She wanted to be a leader the people would follow. She studied the art of oratory, discovered she had a gift for swaying men with her words. She learned from merchants and magisters how to negotiate so that everyone involved believed they had the better half of the deal. When she prayed to the Seven, but also in the Dornish way, calling upon the memory of her mother and the desert sun. In the stillness of night, she called upon the old gods of Valyria, whispered half-forgotten phrases from her father's books, seeking the strength to blaze a path forward. When at last the day came for them to leave Pentos, it came with the hush of a storm gathering at sea. The Golden Company had agreed to pledge itself to Aegon Targaryen, true son of Rhaegar, and Connington insisted they set sail for the Stormlands, where once House Connington held land. The plan: land a small force, seize a key fortress, rally local lords under the banner of the returned prince, and march north to King's Landing. Meanwhile, Dornish forces, if they joined, would come from the south. Rhaenys, however, had her own role. She had negotiated a separate path for herself, a landing in Dorne, accompanied by a fraction of the Golden Company loyal to her. She would meet with Doran Martell, present herself as Elia's daughter, the granddaughter of the Prince of Dorne. She would secure Doran's official backing and unify their power behind Aegon's invasion. So it was decided. 2 Targaryens, each forging a different route into the realm of their birth, each carrying the weight of destiny upon their shoulders. On the night before they boarded their ships, Rhaenys walked along the Pentoshi docks with her brother, the salty wind tugging at their cloaks. He spoke of how he wished she could be by his side in the battle to come. She smiled ruefully and told him they would meet again in King's Landing, when the war was won. "We're dragons, remember," she said. "We can burn through any obstacles as long as we don't let pride lead us astray." He nodded, but she could see the worry in his eyes. Their departure was swift, under cover of darkness. Rhaenys sailed aboard a sleek Pentoshi galley named Sun's Wrath, ironically fitting. The men and women aboard had pledged themselves with sellsword loyalty, though a surprising number bent their knees with genuine reverence when she revealed herself to be Rhaenys Targaryen. She told them quietly that gold would be paid, but a dream drove them all, a dream of restoring the rightful monarchy, one that might heal old wounds. How many had died in Robert's rebellion? How many had lost lands or family, only to see the realm sink deeper into Lannister dominance? The voyage to Dorne was fraught with tension. At any moment, they feared a Royal Navy patrol might intercept them, or that a storm might blow them off course. Rhaenys spent her days pacing the deck, scanning the horizon. She had never been to Dorne. Yet here she was, returning as the living daughter of Elia Martell, who had been murdered as if she were less than nothing. She felt the desert heat in her blood, felt the phantom sting of her mother's final screams urging her onward. She wondered how Prince Doran would react. Would he see her as a mere pretender, an impostor, or would the blood ties be enough? Would Oberyn, the fabled Red Viper, test her mettle? These questions and more haunted her. In her daydreams, she saw herself striding through the water gardens, giving sweet thanks to the memory of her mother, and raising a banner of war alongside the scions of House Martell. Their ship arrived on a moonless night at a hidden cove near the coast of the Broken Arm, far from the main harbors. A pair of Dornish scouts, armed and wary, met them on the sand. Rhaenys stepped off the gangplank, cloaked in black, her heart pounding. She had read that the Dornish nights were warm, but the sea breeze carried a chill that sank into her bones. She introduced herself quietly, pulling back her hood to show her face, her dark, inquisitive eyes, her features that were half Valyrian, half Dornish. One of the scouts stared at her for a long moment, as though beholding a ghost. They exchanged cautious nods, gave curt instructions for her to follow. So began a 3-day trek across rocky terrain, up winding paths. Sellswords from the Golden Company accompanied her along with a few Pentoshi captains who had sworn loyalty. They moved in small groups, avoiding roads patrolled by the crown's men. When at last they neared Sunspear, Rhaenys found her breath caught in her throat. The towering walls of pale stone rose out of the desert. The banners of House Martell, spears and suns, fluttered in the breeze. She remembered the sigil from the stories Varys told, from the tapestry glimpses in her childhood nightmares. This was her mother's home. At the palace gates, Dornish guards with high helms ushered her into a courtyard ringed by tall date palms. In the center, upon a modest dais, sat Prince Doran Martell in a wheeled chair, silent as stone. Beside him stood Oberyn Martell, lean and taut with a coiled energy, his eyes fierce. And around them other Martells, cousins, retainers, courtiers. Rhaenys hesitated just outside the ring of torches. She felt suddenly small, the swirl of memory and fear threatening to consume her. But she forced herself to take steady steps forward, to meet the prince and the viper. At a gesture from Prince Doran, the guards parted. She went to one knee, bowing her head. "I'm Rhaenys Targaryen," she said, her voice trembling only slightly, "daughter of Elia of Dorne and Prince Rhaegar Targaryen. I come to you to seek justice for our family, to reclaim the birthright stolen from us by fire and blood." "Wow." Oberyn stepped forward before Doran could respond. His eyes roved over her face, as though searching for the truth. "They told us you died," he said, voice rough. "They told us you were slain in the Red Keep." She met his gaze unflinching, remembering her mother's words from long ago, how Uncle Oberyn was a spirit of fury and love entwined. "I lived," she said softly, "because someone hid me away. I have come to ask for my mother's kin to stand with me, to avenge her name, to avenge my brother, Aegon. I ask you to believe that I am who I say I am." When I'd watched inside, a hush fell. Doran Martell's expression was pained, but there was a glimmer in his dark eyes. He looked to Oberyn, then back at Rhaenys. "My niece," he whispered at last, "if you are indeed who you claim, there is no limit to what Doran will do for you, but we must know, we must be certain." She had expected this. She reached into the satchel at her side and withdrew a small cameo locket that Varys had given her. Inside was a miniature portrait of Elia Martell, painted in delicate strokes, identical to the one that once hung in the water gardens. She offered it to Doran. "My mother's face," she said. "Varys carried it away from the Red Keep the night she was murdered. I have letters written in her hand, too, with her personal seal." She also showed him her own face, the shape of her nose, the curve of her cheekbones reminiscent of Elia. Oberyn inhaled sharply, tears shining in his eyes. Slowly he reached out and brushed a strand of Rhaenys' hair aside, as though verifying every angle, every detail. Then he stepped back, turned to Doran, and said in a thick voice, "This is Elias' daughter. This is blood of our blood." Prince Doran let out a trembling sigh. His voice was choked with emotion as he proclaimed that Rhaenys was indeed Princess Rhaenys Targaryen of House Martell by birth. The courtyard erupted in whispers. Some knelt. Others stared in shock. The older ones wiped tears from their eyes, remembering the horrors of that day. The younger ones gazed at this tall, determined girl with awe. House Martell had hidden its sorrow for years under a veneer of compliance with King Robert's rule, waiting for the moment to strike. Now, it seemed, destiny had walked back into their courtyard in the shape of Elia's living legacy. In the days that followed, a delicate dance of politics ensued. Rhaenys was given chambers in Sunspear. Servants offered her fine Dornish robes in red and gold. She wandered the arched corridors, the mosaic-tiled floors, her mind reeling at how strange it felt to return to a birthplace she could not remember. She felt an immediate kinship with the blazing sun and the crisp desert air. Each morning, she met with Prince Doran and Oberyn, along with the leading nobles of Dorne. They questioned her about Aegon's existence, about her own plans to depose Robert Baratheon, about the Golden Company's readiness. She answered truthfully. She explained that Connington and Aegon would make landfall in the Stormlands, that she was here to bring Dorne officially into the fold. Some of the lords were hesitant. The Targaryens had been unseated for a reason, they argued. But Oberyn's rage was palpable. "You cowards forget the savage murder of our princess. You forget the mountain that rides, how he crushed her children." He looked to Rhaenys, voice trembling with fury. "This is Elias' daughter. The gods themselves have given us a chance to set things right." In the end, Doran proved the deciding voice. He listened to each argument, weighed the risk of open rebellion. He had endured a marriage alliance with House Lannister, his son, Trystane, betrothed to Myrcella Baratheon, an arrangement meant to secure peace. But now, with a Targaryen heir in their midst, the chance to avenge Elia outweighed any caution. Doran declared that Dorne would pledge its spears to Rhaenys and Aegon's cause, provided they could secure enough alliances to stand a chance against the might of the Iron Throne. Rhaenys felt her spirits soar. Plans were made in secret to raise Dornish forces, gathering them along the southern coast under the cover story of defending against pirate raids. Shipments of arms and provisions would go north under the banner of merchant caravans. Messages went out to certain lords in the Reach who bore old grudges against the Tyrells or the throne. For the first time, Rhaenys saw the wheels turning, the cogs of war sliding into place. The tension hung like a coiled viper ready to strike. She spent her days riding through the wide courtyards and practicing with a spear under Oberyn's tutelage. He insisted she learn the spear's kiss, the Dornish style of combat. She was agile, if not as strong as a knight in plate armor. She found she had an instinctive knack for evading blows and striking from unexpected angles. Each bruise she collected felt like a reminder of her mother's final stand. Elia had none to defend her. Rhaenys would not be so helpless. Within 2 moons' time, word came that Aegon and Jon Connington had landed in the Stormlands. They had taken a minor keep without bloodshed. Local lords were murmuring about the Targaryen boy claiming Rhaegar's lineage. As planned, they put forth a story that Viserys was the beggar king across the sea, while this Aegon was the real heir, having been smuggled out of King's Landing. Some men flocked to his banner for old loyalties, others for the gold or the hope of toppling the Lannister hold on power. Robert Baratheon remained oblivious at first, more interested in a grand tourney being held at Harrenhal in memory of his victory over the Targaryens. But soon ravens arrived in King's Landing bearing urgent warnings. Targaryen boy leads sellswards in the Stormlands. Dorne mobilizes under cloak of secrecy. Robert was said to have roared with laughter at the notion that some Targaryen whelp lived. Only when the news persisted did he dispatch his brothers Stannis and Renly to investigate. Cersei Lannister, queen of the realm, seethed at the idea of a Targaryen threat. She pressed her father, Tywin Lannister, to crush any rebellion swiftly. Tywin, calculating as ever, began to gather Westerman armies. Tensions spiked in the capital. Spies hurried to and fro. While Aegon fought skirmishes in the Stormlands, Rhaenys oversaw the Dornish muster. She traveled across the principalities with Prince Doran's sanction. At each fortress, she addressed the gathered knights and lords, showing them the cameo of Elia, recounting the tragedy of the sack in measured, resolute tones. "We have bowed to Robert Baratheon long enough," she declared, while he and his Lannister queen feasted on the spoils of the dragon's corpse. "My mother was your princess. We will not be silent when her memory cries out for justice." The Dornish, famed for their fierce independence, responded with cheers, pounding spears on the ground. Oberyn joined her on many of these visits, his presence an intimidating promise that this cause was personal. By the time they returned to Sunspear, she had a force of thousands ready to march. At last, word arrived that the king himself, Robert Baratheon, was marching south, having finally realized the gravity of the threat. Renly Baratheon, Lord of Storm's End, had made ambiguous gestures. He might not wholly side with Robert or Stannis, for he harbored ambitions of his own. The realm was fracturing. Across the Crownlands, loyalists to the Targaryen name began to stir. The time had come. Rhaenys stood on the ramparts of Sunspear at dawn, dressed in light armor of burnished scale, a scarlet cloak draping her shoulders. She felt the desert wind on her face, stirring her hair. She closed her eyes and recalled the faint memory of her mother's face, the comforting warmth of her arms. She swore that if it took her last breath, she would see justice done. They marched. Thousands of Dornish spearmen, lightly armored cavalry, and archers traversed the treacherous passes of the Red Mountains, heading north. Their banners streamed in the sun, spears and suns emblazoned. At their head rode Rhaenys Targaryen, flanked by Oberyn Martell and other Dornish lords. The Golden Company detachments joined them, gold and black banners mingling with red. Each night, Rhaenys conferred with her captains around a map by torchlight. She slept little, plagued by the knowledge that her father had once marched these roads, brimming with hope, only to fall at the trident. Now she was forging her own path, determined not to repeat past mistakes. As the host neared the Stormlands, they discovered that Aegon had gained a foothold in several minor strongholds. Jon Connington had managed a string of small victories against local lords loyal to Robert. Stannis Baratheon remained stationed at Dragonstone, uncertain whether to move or wait. Robert himself, along with Tywin Lannister's vanguard, was said to be encamped near Summerhall, the old Targaryen ruin. Ironic that Robert would choose that ground. Rhaenys decided they had to strike quickly, before the combined might of the royal army could converge. A plan was formed. She would march north to link with Aegon's forces near the ruins of Summerhall, hoping to catch Robert unprepared. Their first real battle erupted in the rolling hills southwest of Summerhall. Scouts brought word that a portion of the king's army, led by a minor lord sworn to the crown, was approaching. Rhaenys saw the dust rising in the distance. She remembered the spear lessons Oberyn had taught her, the hours spent learning tactics from Connington's war stories. Her heart hammered in her chest. No matter how she had prepared, the reality of leading troops into battle was terrifying. She wore a half-helm, her cloak pinned with a brooch shaped like a golden dragon. She raised her arm, and the Dornish trumpets sounded. They clashed at midday. Arrows whistled overhead, spears bristled in the bright sunlight. The Dornish used their speed and superior knowledge of the terrain to outflank the enemy. Rhaenys rode with a small cavalry unit, trusting Oberyn to direct the main assault. Dust choked the air, and the screams of men and horses rang in her ears. She felt the sting of steel more than once, but her armor held. She used her spear to unhorse a knight who charged her, adrenaline surging in her veins. She saw her banner shimmering amidst the chaos, the red and gold of House Martell and Targaryen combined. By late afternoon, the crown's host was in disarray, retreating north. Rhaenys surveyed the field, panting, her cheeks smudged with dirt and sweat. The ground was littered with bodies. She had tasted her first victory, and it tasted of iron and dust. She felt no elation, only a grim resolve. This was what reclaiming the throne looked like, blood and death. She thought of her mother's final moments in the Red Keep, how helpless she must have been. Rhaenys refused to be powerless ever again. They advanced further, meeting skirmishes along the way. News spread like wildfire that a Targaryen princess led the Dornish host. Some called her the Viper's niece, others the Sun Dragon. Robert, at last realizing the scope of the threat, regrouped with Tywin Lannister's men. A large confrontation seemed imminent. Meanwhile, Aegon and Connington arrived from the east with a growing band of Stormlander lords who had sworn fealty. At an abandoned fortress near Summerhall, the two Targaryen heirs reunited. Aegon, taller now, with short silver-blonde hair, no longer dyed, caught Rhaenys in a fierce embrace. They exchanged stories of their victories, their near misses, their determination that soon they would stand outside the gates of King's Landing. Connington pressed for an immediate thrust toward the capital, to strike before Robert could gather more forces. But Oberyn cautioned that the Lannister might of the West was still untested. Dorne's army had some fight left, but war was draining. Rhaenys weighed these perspectives, aware that the final decision rested with her and Aegon. In council, they decided on a two-pronged strategy. Aegon would lead a swift cavalry detachment to harass Robert's supply lines and cut off his approach from the north. Rhaenys, with the bulk of the Dornish host, would move around the southern side and attempt to pin Robert's forces against the remnants of Summerhall's walls. If all went well, they could trap the king between them. It was a bold plan, reminiscent of her father's more cunning maneuvers. She felt the ghost of Rhaegar at her shoulder, urging caution. She could almost hear him whisper, "Do not let arrogance blind you." The day of the battle dawned under a sky streaked with red clouds. Soldiers on both sides took it as a portent, whether for blood or for victory no one could say. Rhaenys rode at the head of her line, Oberyn beside her. She had tried to talk him out of leading the vanguard given his importance, but he insisted that battle was in his blood. Across the field, she could see the king's banners, the black stag on gold, snapping in the breeze. Her heart clenched when she remembered that monstrous crown on the head of the man who had toppled House Targaryen. Robert Baratheon, rumored to be larger now, with a thick beard, was still formidable on the battlefield. He had not lost his penchant for the warhammer, they said. Even from a distance, She sensed the menacing energy that once felled her father at the Trident. The horn sounded. The armies lurched into motion. Knights thundered across the plain. Infantry advanced with shields locked. War cries filled the air. Rhaenys spurred her horse forward, brandishing her spear. The front lines smashed together with a cacophony that rattled her teeth. She tried to keep track of Oberyn, but the swirl of bodies and weapons quickly separated them. She let her training take over. Strike, pivot, block, keep moving. Her arms ached from the force of the blows. She glimpsed the king's stag banner drawing closer, accompanied by the roar of Robert's booming war cries. She knew Aegon's cavalry was supposed to come in from the flank, but in the chaos, all she could do was fight for her life and press forward. Time lost meaning in the haze of violence. The clang of steel, the screams, the hot wash of blood. She saw the golden lion of the Lannisters somewhere in the fray. Tywin's men had joined Robert's, forging a formidable shield wall. Then, through the dust, she saw him, Robert Baratheon, astride a great warhorse, clad in plate mail with the crowned stag on his breast. His warhammer rose and fell, crushing armor and bone. The sight of him made her blood run cold and hot all at once. Here was the man who had condoned the murder of her mother, who wore the throne that should have been her father's. A surge of fury lent her strength she did not know she possessed. She spurred her horse, weaving through the melee until she was nearly upon him. "Baratheon!" she shouted, voice cracking. He turned, eyes blazing beneath his helm. For a moment he looked confused. Who was this Dornish warrior daring to challenge him? And then he saw her face. Perhaps he saw the echoes of Rhaegar in her features, or the martell in her dark eyes. Recognition flickered, followed by a snarl. "Targaryen!" he roared, hoisting the warhammer. That was all the time they had for words. She lunged, spear aiming for his chest. He swung the hammer in an arc that nearly unhorsed her. She felt the rush of air, heard the crunch as he missed her by mere inches. Her spear point glanced off his breastplate, deflected by steel. Their horses circled, hooves pounding the turf. Her heart thundered, adrenaline spiking. This was madness, she realized. She was not the warrior her father had been. Robert Baratheon was a force of nature on the battlefield. Yet she refused to yield. She feinted left, thrusting her spear at his horse, trying to spook the beast. He snarled, yanking the reins, and brought the hammer down. She barely managed to twist aside, the head of the warhammer smashing into the ground. Dirt and grass exploded. Her spear snapped when she tried to block another hammer blow. She cursed, discarding the splintered shaft. Instinct took over. She drew a short sword from her hip, ducked under Robert's neck swing, and raked the blade against his thigh, where the armor parted. She felt resistance as the steel bit flesh. He let out a roar of pain, lashing out with a gauntleted fist that clipped her shoulder. Agony shot through her, and she nearly toppled from the saddle. Spots danced before her eyes. She heard him bellow, "You'll die like your father." But at that moment, the line of battle surged. More Dornish spearmen crashed into Robert's flank, jostling them apart. Rhaenys' horse whinnied, stumbling away. She could no longer see him, lost in the press of bodies. She gasped for air, blood trickling from beneath her armor. Pain radiated through her entire left side. She fought off a disoriented knight bearing the lion's sigil. She glimpsed the vantage of the field for just a moment, and saw another wave of cavalry sweeping in from the east, their banners that of the Golden Company and Targaryen black and red. Aegon had arrived. In a thunderous charge, Aegon's cavalry smashed into the king's flank, sowing chaos. Trumpets blared. Rhaenys rallied, calling the Dornish forward. The combined pressure folded Robert's line in on itself. She could hear men shouting, "Retreat! Retreat!" The stag banner was moving north, away from the press. If Robert was leaving the field, it meant the day was lost for him. She wanted to pursue, to finish what had begun, but she was too wounded, her horse flagging. The battlefield was a churn of gore and broken bodies. She found Oberyn at last, his spear dripping blood, a small gash on his brow. He asked if she was hurt. "Only a little," she managed, swallowing back the throbbing pain. By dusk, the royal army was in full retreat. The Targaryen Dornish host had claimed the field, though the cost in lives was steep. A field strewn with dead and dying men was their prize. Rhaenys slid off her horse, stumbling as Oberyn caught her. She pressed a hand to her side, feeling the warmth of blood. "We won," she said, almost disbelieving. They had driven back Robert Baratheon himself. Word spread quickly. The king was wounded, his forces scattered, Tywin Lannister withdrawing to regroup. Aegon found her among the wounded and clasped her hand, tears in his eyes. "We've done it," he said. "We've proven we are more than ghosts." That night, they lit funeral pyres for the fallen and tended to the wounded in makeshift tents. Rhaenys had her injuries cleaned and stitched. The maesters insisted she rest, but she refused to lie down until she had walked among the soldiers, offering what comfort and thanks she could. She felt no triumph, only a sober realization. They had drawn first blood in a war that was about to consume the realm. Robert was not defeated. He was merely pushed back. Tywin Lannister's armies remained a fearsome threat. Word might reach the Reach, the Riverlands, the Vale, spurring them to choose sides. The Game of Thrones had begun again in earnest. In the weeks that followed, the Targaryen forces consolidated their hold on the Stormlands, capturing several key fortresses. Dorne poured in more troops and supplies. Aegon and Connington sent envoys to the Reach, hoping to sway Mace Tyrell. Rhaenys, nursing her injuries, spent long hours strategizing with Oberyn. She wanted to ensure they did not overextend as Rhaegar had. They needed to keep the momentum while forging alliances. Rumors trickled in that the Queen, Cersei, had lobbied for Tywin to recall the bulk of the Lannister forces and instead guard the capital. She feared a direct assault on King's Landing. As the year turned, the Targaryen's banner flew from Storm's End. Renly Baratheon had yielded the castle to Aegon in a curious twist of politics, claiming that Robert's disregard had soured him. Some said Renly had his own designs for the throne, and saw an opportunity to undermine his brother. Regardless, the Targaryen influence now extended across the Stormlands, with Dorne at their back. One morning, Rhaenys stood on the battlements of Storm's End, gazing out at the sea. The sunrise painted the waters pink and gold. She thought of King's Landing, the red keep looming on the horizon beyond the curve of the coast. She had escaped that fortress as a terrified child, hidden in darkness. Now, she was returning as a challenger to the crown, bringing war to the usurpers. She wondered if it was fate or irony that she would be the one to stand at its gates. The ghosts of her mother and brother, Aegon the infant, seemed to whisper in the wind, urging her onward. She heard footsteps behind her and turned to see Aegon approach. His face was wan, lined with the burdens of command. "We've come far," he said softly. She nodded. He reached out and took her hand, giving it a gentle squeeze. "Will the realm welcome us, or will we be seen as conquerors in our own land, ruling by the sword?" Rhaenys studied his expression. He was older now, not just in years, but in the weight on his soul. "We do what we must," she replied. "We end Robert's reign. We bring the Lannisters to justice for what they did to our family. And then we heal the realm, one step at a time." Aegon nodded, his gaze drifting to the horizon. "Robert will not stop. We must face him again, perhaps at King's Landing itself. He'll call upon every banner he can. The realm might bleed." His voice trembled with the kind of remorse that comes from a good heart forced into cruelty. "I wish there was another way." She reached up, unhooked a small dragon pendant from around her neck, and pressed it into his hand. "Father believed in a prophecy," she murmured. "He named me Rhaenys, after Aegon the Conqueror's sister. I never knew what he saw for our futures, but we can shape our own. The realm is ours to protect, if we prove worthy." That evening, fresh tidings arrived. Robert Baratheon, recovered from his wound, had joined forces with Tywin Lannister near King's Landing, where they fortified the city's defenses. The Tyrells had yet to commit. The North, under Eddard Stark, seemed distant and reluctant, but rumors said Ned Stark was displeased with the Lannisters for other reasons. The Vale remained aloof, governed by the young Lord Robert Arryn and his mother, Lysa Tully. Each piece on the board was shifting. The stage was set for a confrontation at King's Landing. The Targaryens had to decide whether to press their advantage or try to isolate the Lannisters further. Connington urged a bold strike. Oberyn counseled caution, suggesting they entice the Tyrells into neutrality first. Rhaenys realized that the final march on the capital would define everything. If they attacked too soon and lost, all would be undone. If they hesitated and let Robert gather more allies, the advantage might slip away. In council, she sat beside Aegon at the long table. The flicker of torchlight played across maps scattered with carved sigils representing each house. Connington argued that the city might open its gates if faced with overwhelming force. Oberyn retorted that Tywin Lannister would never yield. Aegon glanced at Rhaenys as though seeking her guidance. She placed a hand on the map, tracing the path from Storm's End to the capital. If we show the realm we can win without burning it to ashes, more lords will flock to our side, she said. I refuse to be like the Mad King. We will not scorch King's Landing or punish the small folk for living under Baratheon rule. No. Despite reservations, they elected to march on King's Landing in the coming weeks, hoping to force Robert into a pitched battle rather than a siege. If the city's gates closed, they would set camps around it and wait for the Lannisters to make a move. Dornish outriders would feint toward the Reach, ensuring Mace Tyrell stayed cautious. In short, they would attempt a show of controlled strength. The morning of their departure from Storm's End brought howling winds and dark clouds, but the armies formed ranks regardless. A sea of spears stretched across the fields with banners snapping. Rhaenys, mounted on a dappled mare, wore a battered half-helm that still bore scars from the last battle. Aegon rode beside her, regal in his black armor with a three-headed dragon etched in silver. Behind them came the Golden Company, Dornish knights, spearmen, archers, and Stormlander defectors who had pledged loyalty. Connington directed a rear guard that would fend off any surprise attacks. They advanced along the Roseread, the countryside trembling at their approach. Farmers hid their stores, uncertain which side they should fear more. Scouts reported that Robert had gathered a large host near the Blackwater, preparing to confront them outside the city walls. For days, tension built as they drew closer. Rhaenys felt her stomach knot. Each evening she remembered the nightmares of her childhood. Cloaked men in red and gold, swords dripping with blood, a mother's scream cut short. She prayed to the Seven for strength. She walked among the common soldiers, reminding them that if they prevailed, the realm would be freed from a king who had neglected them in favor of feasts and hunts. She told them of her mother's death at Lannister hands, igniting their sense of justice. At last, the spires of King's Landing loomed in the distance, the waters of Blackwater Bay shining faintly. The city walls stood thick, the banners of House Baratheon and House Lannister flying from the ramparts. Smoke coiled from the city's chimneys, a testament to the thousands who dwelt within. The Targaryen host halted upon a broad plain southeast of the city. The outskirts were dotted with farmhouses and small holdings, the roads bustling with refugees fleeing inside for protection. The Red Keep perched on its hill like a great stone beast, reminding Rhaenys of all she had lost. A hush fell over the camp that night. The smell of rain and mud clung to everything. Patrols circled the perimeter. Torches burned in the gloom. Rhaenys sat alone for a time, gazing at the silhouette of the Red Keep against the stormy sky. She recalled the secret passages Varys had shown her, the labyrinth beneath the castle. Was it only as impenetrable as men believed? She realized how small she had been, how vulnerable, cowering under that bed. The memory steeled her resolve. She was not that child anymore. Before dawn, spies returned with word. Robert's forces were arrayed on the western side of the city, blocking the Gold Road. Tywin Lannister commanded a segment near the main gates, while the king himself was said to be in the field, prepared to meet the Targaryens head-on. If they could break Robert's line, the city might surrender, or so the reasoning went. Aegon and Rhaenys conferred one final time with their captains. The plan was to lure Robert forward, feint a retreat, then allow Dornish cavalry to slam his flank. Meanwhile, Connington would bring his forces around from the south to cut off any Lannister reinforcements. A risky gambit, but if executed well, it could lead to a swift victory. The battle began under a sky bruised with dawn. The Targaryen host advanced across the muddy fields, raising their battle cries. Robert's men answered, ranks of infantry bristling with pikes and shields. War horns resounded. The ground soon churned under the feet of thousands. Rhaenys, near the center, led her unit forward, her banner streaming behind her. Aegon was off to the left, while Oberyn took a more mobile force to the right flank. The clash was brutal, Arrows whistled from the city walls, though many fell short. The ring of steel echoed across the plain. At first, Robert's line held firm. Rhaenys found herself nearly overwhelmed by the press of bodies. She slashed and parried, the adrenaline making time blur. She could not see her brother, only glimpses of the Targaryen standard amidst the melee. At some point, the plan was set in motion. A horn sounded 3 short blasts, the signal for a feigned retreat. Dutifully, Rhaenys and her unit pulled back, giving ground. Robert's men, seeing an apparent weakness, surged forward, shouting victory too soon. That was when Oberyn's cavalry charged in from the side, spearing through their disorganized ranks. Chaos reigned. War cries, screams, the dull thud of spears finding flesh. Rhaenys pressed forward again. She spurred her horse, cutting down a banner-bearer who tried to rally the king's men. She heard the ring of steel on steel. The smell of blood clogged her senses. Then she saw Robert only yards away, locked in combat with Aegon. Her brother clutched a sword, deflecting the king's massive hammer strikes with visible effort. Each blow threatened to knock him off balance. Sparks flew as steel met steel. Rhaenys' heart leapt into her throat. She urged her mount toward them. Robert caught sight of her and snarled. He swung his warhammer at Aegon's leg, forcing the younger man to pivot. "You Targaryen pretender!" Robert spat. "I'll kill you like I killed your father." Aegon grimaced, holding his ground. Rhaenys saw an opening. Robert's flank was exposed for a moment as he overcommitted to the swing. She raised her spear, the memory of her snapped weapon haunting her from their last confrontation. This time, her spear was of Dornish steel, forged by master smiths. She hurled it with all her might. The spear flew in a deadly arc. Robert twisted at the last second, so the spear bit into his upper arm rather than his chest. He roared in pain, staggering. Aegon seized the opening to thrust his sword beneath the edge of Robert's breastplate. Blood spurted. The king let out a bellow and swung the hammer wildly. Aegon ducked, barely escaping the blow that would have smashed his skull. Rhaenys dismounted and rushed forward, drawing her short sword. Tywin's bannermen were close, but Oberyn's cavalry intercepted them. Robert stumbled, glaring at the 2 Targaryens. Pain etched lines across his face. He pressed a hand to his wounded side and spat curses. "You'll never hold the realm," he growled, voice trembling. "The Lannisters." He didn't finish. Aegon stepped in, sword raised to demand his surrender. But Robert, even in agony, was too proud. He swung his hammer at Aegon's chest, forcing the prince back. Then he turned to Rhaenys, murder in his gaze. "And you, Elia's Get, I should have snuffed you out with my bare hands that day." Rage flooded her, white hot. She remembered her mother's screams, the nights of hiding, the blood spattered on the Red Keep's floors. She advanced, her short sword thrust forward. Robert roared, trying to raise the hammer again, but his arm was weakened, pinned with a spear. Aegon came at him from behind, a slicing blow aimed at his knee. Robert collapsed to one side, bellowing like a wounded bull. The hammer fell from his grip, thudding into the churned mud. He was on his knees, half supported by a broken pike. Blood poured down his side. Around them, the battle was turning decisively in favor of the Targaryens. Lannister banners wavered as men began to flee. Tywin was nowhere in sight, likely withdrawing into the city or retreating west. Aegon stood panting, sword tip pointed at Robert's throat. Rhaenys, trembling with the weight of it all, met Robert's gaze. In his eyes, she saw hatred, but also a flicker of acknowledgement that he was beaten. "Surrender," Aegon demanded. "Yield the throne you stole." Robert spat blood. "You're mad if you think I'll bend the knee to Targaryen scum. Kill me if you have the stomach." Rhaenys tightened her grip on the sword. She recalled how, in her younger days, she had dreamed of confronting this man, the usurper who had destroyed her family. Now it felt hollow. The realm's fate hovered in the balance. She could take his life and avenge her mother, or she could spare him and risk more war. Aegon's face hardened, but he looked to her. In that moment the swirl of memory overwhelmed her. Her mother's warm smile, the terror of that night, the endless flight across the sea. She raised her short sword and Robert closed his eyes as though resigned. Then she hesitated, meeting Aegon's gaze and saw in his eyes the same conflict. If Robert lived, might he continue to rally opposition? Could the realm unify if the old king was allowed to stand trial or exiled? Rage warred with reason. At length, she lowered her blade. The battlefield around them was littered with the dead. The living watched this tableau with bated breath. Rhaenys exhaled shakily. "We're not like you," she said quietly. "We don't butcher children in their beds." Then she nodded to Aegon, who stepped forward, raising his sword hilt. With a swift motion, he slammed the pommel into Robert's temple, knocking him unconscious. The king slumped forward, bloodied and beaten but alive. A ragged cheer rose from the Dornish lines, from the Golden Company, from all who witnessed the downfall of the usurper. The stag banners that remained began to fall back in earnest, some casting away their weapons. The Targaryen siblings, battered and exhausted, stood over their vanquished foe. Rhaenys' breath came in gasps. Her side ached. Aegon offered her a hand, and she realized she was shaking. She gripped it, finding support in her brother's presence. And so Robert Baratheon's reign ended not with a hero's last stand, but with a battered king on his knees, undone by the very children he thought he had killed. The survivors of the royal army scattered. Tywin Lannister, upon hearing of Robert's capture, chose to retreat westward, leaving the capital's defense to Cersei and her guards. But with Robert in Targaryen hands, half the city's defenders were ready to surrender. The gates were opened by conspirators within who feared sack or starvation. King's Landing, at last, lay before Rhaenys and Aegon, a city that had once been the seat of their forefathers. They entered at dusk, the crowds of small folk lining the streets. Some jeered, some watched with fearful eyes, unsure how these Targaryens would rule. Rhaenys felt uneasy, remembering the last time an army had stormed King's Landing. She ordered her men to keep discipline, to refrain from pillaging. She wanted no repeat of the horrors of her childhood. A hush fell as the Targaryen banners were raised atop the Red Keep. Soldiers took control of the gates and walls. Word spread that King Robert was a prisoner. Sir Barristan Selmy, once a king's guard to the Targaryens, came forward and knelt, pledging his sword. He had served Robert loyally for years, but his oath was to the crown, and now the crown was Targaryen once more. Rhaenys was moved by the sight of the white cloak in the gloom. Perhaps not all ties to the old house had been severed by war. Cersei Lannister was found in Maegor's holdfast, guarded by gold cloaks and Lannister soldiers. She had her children with her, Joffrey, Myrcella, Tommen, terrified. Oberyn Martell took grim satisfaction in seeing Tywin's daughter caged. But for Rhaenys, it was another burden. These children were not guilty of the crimes of their parents, yet they were Baratheons and Lannisters. She had them placed under guard, making it clear no harm would come to them if they did not resist. Cersei raged, flinging insults, calling the Targaryens traitors and murderers. She spat at Rhaenys' feet when forced to stand aside. Rhaenys only stared back, coldly. She remembered how House Lannister had shown her family no mercy, but she would not stoop to slaughtering children. In the grand throne room, the Iron Throne loomed, forged of 1,000 swords, a symbol of power and betrayal. Rhaenys approached it with trembling steps. Aegon stood at her side, blood-stained and weary. This was the seat their ancestors had taken by dragonfire. The Targaryen banners had been found and displayed, once hidden away, replaced by Robert's stag for nearly 2 decades. Now the red and black of the dragons hung once more from the pillars. The watchers in the hall, nobles, guards, onlookers, fell silent. The hush was broken only by the crackle of torches and the distant thunder of hooves in the courtyard. Aegon spoke first, declaring that the rule of the usurper was ended. He affirmed his lineage, son of Prince Rhaegar Targaryen and Elia Martell, rightful heir to the Iron Throne. Rhaenys listened, feeling a swirl of emotions. All her life she had been that hidden child, the lost princess believed slain. And here she stood, at the brink of reclaiming everything lost. When Aegon finished, he turned to her, offered his hand, and guided her up the steps. Together they faced the Iron Throne. The hall held its breath. Aegon closed his eyes, then sat. The clang of his sword against the metal rung out, a moment that marked the enthronement of a new Targaryen king. Rhaenys stood beside him, her chin high, her gaze fierce. She felt the weight of countless lives pressing down. This was not merely vengeance or victory. It was an inheritance steeped in blood and shadow. Yet she also felt a spark of hope, hope that she and her brother might usher in a reign that could mend the realm's wounds. She could almost sense the spirits of her parents, Elia and Rhaegar, whispering through the corridors. The war was not entirely over. The Lannisters had retreated, the Tyrells remained uncertain, the North was still distant, and the Vale perched on a knife's edge. But King's Landing had fallen. Robert Baratheon was in their custody. The city no longer needed to fear a sack from the Targaryen side. They were determined to rule with mercy, not madness. People knelt, some grudgingly, some in relief. Outside, a gentle rain began to fall, washing away the bloodstains on the cobblestones. For Rhaenys it felt like a baptism of sorts, a quiet renewal. She looked around the throne room at the battered soldiers, the lords who were deciding where their loyalty lay. She recalled the last time she had been here, a frightened child carried by Varys through hidden passages. Now, she stood in the open, unafraid, a living testament that House Targaryen was not finished. Her journey had begun in fear and loss, but it led her here, to the seat of her family's power. A swirl of thoughts rushed in, the dream of a healed realm, the dream of justice for her mother, the dream of forging a future that need not be drenched in endless bloodshed. She placed a hand on the arm of the Iron Throne, meeting Aegon's gaze. He gave a small nod of encouragement. Then she turned to the assembled court, her voice carrying clear and steady. "I stand before you as Princess Rhaenys Targaryen, daughter of Rhaegar and Elia. The dawn of our house has come again. We will rule not by madness, nor cruelty, but with justice. Those who lay down arms are offered clemency. Those who choose war will find we have teeth. Let the realm see that dragons have returned." A hush reigned, broken slowly by the sound of men and women lowering themselves to their knees in submission. Perhaps it was fear, perhaps hope. The Targaryen banners swayed overhead. Lightning flashed outside, illuminating the stained glass windows. In that flicker of brilliance, Rhaenys thought she saw, just for a moment, the faint outline of a dragon's shadow across the throne room floor. A sign, or a trick of the light, she could not say. All she knew was that the city was theirs, the usurper toppled. The war for the Seven Kingdoms would continue in political chambers and on distant battlefields. But for this moment, for this heartbeat in time, Rhaenys Targaryen could breathe freely. She had survived. She had come home. And in her heart, she promised her mother that this was only the beginning of a new chapter in the story of House Targaryen, one where the ghosts of the past might finally be laid to rest, and a brighter fire kindled to guide the realm forward. Rhaenys Targaryen stood in the throne room beneath the pale light of dusk, the weight of the realm pressing on her shoulders like a tangible presence. She could feel its pull in the hush of the courtiers who gathered at the edges of the vast hall, in the shifting glances of the men and women who had pledged themselves, some eagerly, some fearfully, to House Targaryen. Only hours had passed since she and her brother Aegon had seized King's Landing, ending the Baratheon dynasty with a suddenness that left the city in a state of stunned disbelief. She still tasted the copper tang of blood on her tongue whenever she breathed too deeply, her body aching in memory of the battle. She gazed up at Aegon on the Iron Throne. His face was pale from wounds and exhaustion, but his posture was regal, his chin set. The sword in his hand trembled slightly. That trembling was the only betrayal of the tempest that surely raged in his heart. Only a handful of people had actually seen them bring King Robert to his knees on the battlefield beyond the walls, but word traveled faster than truth. By now, all of King's Landing knew that Robert Baratheon had been captured, that his reign was over. Now the question that plagued them was what the new Targaryen king and his sister would do next. Rhaenys felt eyes on her too. Many recognized her face for the first time. She was no ghost after all. The dark-haired princess who had supposedly been slain in the Red Keep all those years ago now stood alive and strong on the crimson carpet, gazing calmly at the very seat her ancestors had built. She wondered what her younger self might think of this moment, how impossible it would have seemed. She could almost see the little girl cowering under a bed, the flickering shadows of her mother's last moments etched forever in her mind. A line of battered prisoners had been led in, ranking officers of Robert's host who had not managed to flee with Tywin Lannister. The rumors said Tywin was withdrawing west, refusing to sacrifice his forces in a city sure to fall. If that was so, then the final bastion of Lannister power lay behind the walls of Casterly Rock. Whether it was cunning or cowardice, Tywin had left King's Landing to its fate. And so it was that only a fraction of the royal army had remained to defend the city. Even fewer had chosen to fight on once the Targaryen banners blossomed inside the gates. Oberyn Martell and a handful of Dornish captains had also come into the throne room. Oberyn bore a bandage wrapping his arm. He hid the pain well, though his gaze was alert, flicking from face to face. He had waited years, decades, to see justice done for his sister Elia and her children. Now, though Robert Baratheon's capture was a staggering victory, Oberyn's eyes glittered with the knowledge that Tywin Lannister still drew breath. Tywin, and perhaps the mountain who had murdered Rhaenys' infant brother Aegon. The memory of that massacre lived in Oberyn like a fever, but for the moment, he stood quietly, allowing these first moments of Targaryen rule to unfold. Rhaenys stepped forward. Her steps echoed across the vaulted chamber. The courtiers stood back, giving her room, wariness etched into their faces. She noticed Ser Barristan Selmy among them, wearing the plain mail of a soldier rather than the white cloak. He had removed it for the battle, or perhaps in confusion after Robert's defeat. Yet now, as Rhaenys approached, Barristan stepped forth and lowered himself to one knee. He said nothing at first, merely bowed his head. But that small gesture of respect from a man once known as Barristan the Bold made her throat tighten unexpectedly. She inclined her head and bid him rise. Barristan's voice, rough from shouting in the heat of battle, rang loud enough for all to hear. "Your Grace," he said, though he looked first at Aegon and then at her, uncertain which Targaryen now held his oath. "I lived through the reign of King Aerys, and served King Robert as well. I have seen the realm under tyranny and under a ruler who cared more for feasting than for justice. If House Targaryen means to restore honor to the throne, then I am yours to command." A hush fell. Rhaenys could sense the relief in the watchers. Barristan Selmy had been a legend, a knight known for his unwavering sense of duty. For him to bend the knee so readily suggested that perhaps these Targaryens were not the monsters of old. She glanced at Aegon, who nodded gratefully. Rhaenys then spoke with a steadiness that belied her trembling heart. "Ser Barristan, we welcome your sword and your counsel. Stand and know that your loyalty will be remembered in the new reign." "No." Barristan rose, eyes flicking between brother and sister. She sensed the question stirring in him. Which of them would truly hold power? Everyone in the realm had been taught that if a Targaryen prince survived, he was the rightful king. But Rhaenys was no mere decoration. She stood as living proof that the line of Elia Martell had survived, that the realm's horrors could not be erased so easily. For now, the question of her exact title could wait. "We must address the fate of the captive king," she continued, projecting her voice across the hall. "Bring Robert Baratheon before us." A sharp command went out, and within moments, a pair of Dornish guards at the far end of the throne room parted to admit a group of soldiers escorting Robert. Stripped of his shining plate, now in mud-splattered breeches and a torn tunic, he looked every inch the battered warrior. His beard was matted with blood, one eye swollen shut from the pommel strike that had ended the fight. A hastily bandaged wound in his side showed where Aegon's sword had pierced him. Still, he walked without cringing, head high, his hands bound with thick rope. At the sight of him, the hush in the hall thickened. Rhaenys felt her pulse hammer in her ears. She recalled his savage roars on the field, the glint of madness in his eyes, and the memory of that warhammer swung at her head. Across the hall, men who had once called him king looked away or stared at him in horror. In another time, in another place, half these courtiers might have rushed to his defense. But defeat had a way of stripping a man of illusions. There was no question who held power now. One of the Dornish guards shoved Robert forward. He nearly stumbled at the base of the throne steps, but caught himself. He glowered up at Aegon. "So," he rasped, "come to finish what your wretched father started, mad king's spawn that you are." Aegon's jaw tightened, but he gave no answer. Rhaenys stepped to her brother's side and let the tension hang for a moment. She understood the fury that burned in Robert's heart, the humiliation. She also understood that the realm watched their next move. If they butchered him on the throne room floor, would that not confirm every rumor that Targaryens were bloodthirsty tyrants? But if they simply allowed him to go free, They risked letting a wounded beast crawl away to strike at them again. "We have not yet decided your fate," Rhaenys said, and the words reverberated off the stone walls. "You stand accused of usurpation, of unlawfully seizing the throne of House Targaryen, and of condoning the murders of Princess Elia Martell and her children." Robert spat, and the spittle hit the floor near his feet. "The Mad King brought war upon himself. Your father." He glared at Aegon, then at Rhaenys. "Rhaegar, he may have been more mild than Rhaenys, but he still caused the realm to bleed. I did what had to be done." Rhaenys trembled at the invocation of her father's name. This man had killed Rhaegar Targaryen on the trident with a single blow of his hammer. She forced herself to breathe slowly. "You did what you believed was necessary," she said, voice quiet but carrying. "But you did not stop with Rhaenys or with Rhaegar. Your supporters, the Lannisters you allowed at your side, murdered my mother and my brother Aegon in cold blood." Robert's good eye narrowed. "I never ordered the killing of Elia and the babe. That was Tywin's doing, or his men's. I was told it was already done." A hint of remorse flickered across his battered face. "You Targaryens would have destroyed the realm had you stayed on that throne. I only prevented more bloodshed." "Enough," Aegon snapped. The ring of steel accompanied his frustration as he moved on the throne, shifting his sword. "Your words will not excuse what happened. You crowned yourself in the blood of innocence." He hesitated, as though wanting to say more, then glanced at Rhaenys. She read the uncertainty in his eyes. She saw him wrestling with the urge to end Robert's life here and now. But he had always been the more measured, thoughtful one, or so she liked to believe. A long silence followed. The courtiers seemed to shrink back. Even the Dornish guards, who loathed Robert for his part in the war, stood rigidly, waiting for an order. Barristan watched with caution. Oberyn, arms folded, stared with a thunderous glare. Rhaenys knew he would kill Robert without blinking if given the chance. Yet the realm's eyes were upon them. They had to do better. She spoke at last. "We will not butcher you in this hall. We are not the Lannisters. We remember how you permitted that evil, and we refuse to descend to it. But we cannot set you free to challenge us again." Robert let out a ragged bark of laughter. "Mercy from a Targaryen. The world must be going mad." Rhaenys felt a flash of anger. "Guard your tongue," she warned him. "Your insults no longer have weight. We will keep you under guard until a formal council can be convened. There will be a trial, if that is your right, though it is more than you ever allowed my mother and brother. Until that day you remain our prisoner." "Niazae." Robert's lip curled in contempt, but he did not argue further. The Dornish soldiers dragged him away. Rhaenys could not look at him too long. She feared the anger that rose within her, that threatened to consume any sense of mercy she might muster. She recalled her mother's final screams echoing in the Red Keep, the stories of how the mountain called Gregor Clegane had dashed her infant brother's head against a wall. Robert could pretend he had not ordered it, but he had profited from it all the same. When Robert had gone, the throne room remained deathly silent. Then Aegon lifted his voice to address the gathering. "We claim this city by right. But House Targaryen is not here to slay the small folk or bring wanton vengeance. We are here to restore the rightful rule. Any who bend the knee shall be offered pardon. Those who plot against us will share in the downfall of the usurper. We will have no tolerance for those who would bring further suffering upon the realm." His words were carefully measured, but the effect was powerful. The watchers exchanged glances, some bowing more deeply. Rhaenys could sense the faint stirring of hope in the crowd. After years under a king who seemed to rule with his appetites rather than his mind, perhaps a new beginning was not unwelcome. And so it began. That night, the Targaryen forces took control of the city's gates and walls in earnest. Dornish archers were stationed on the battlements, while loyal Stormlander knights patrolled the major thoroughfares to maintain order. Oberyn took the lead in rooting out any Lannister men who might attempt sabotage. Meanwhile, the Golden Company quartered itself in the streets near Flea Bottom. Their captains had been promised gold, but they also held a loyalty of sorts to Rhaenys and Aegon, or at least to the dream of a Targaryen restoration. Among the small folk, fear lingered. Many remembered the sack of King's Landing under Tywin's men, how rapine and murder had reigned. Now ironically it was a Targaryen army that occupied the city, but this time, They had strict orders to keep the peace. To Rhaenys' relief, the only violence that erupted in the first days was small scale, a few brawls, a handful of looters. The Targaryen leadership acted quickly to punish such crimes. Word spread that the new regime would not tolerate chaos. The question of how they would style themselves remained. Aegon's claim was straightforward. He was, in theory, the rightful king of the Andals, the Rhoynar and the First Men. Yet Rhaenys was older by a year, the first child of Rhaegar. Traditionally, the crown would pass through male primogeniture, but the realm had never seen a situation quite like this. A brother and sister, each with claims, each believed dead, and now miraculously alive. For now, they presented themselves as a united front. Aegon was the king, and Rhaenys was his sister, a princess of the blood. Yet in private councils, Rhaenys took an equal seat at the table. No major decision was made without her voice. The men who had seen them on the battlefield recognized that she was no mere bystander. Inside the Red Keep, they discovered relics of the old Targaryen dynasty, tapestries hidden away, statues that had been defaced or stored in dusty antechambers. Rhaenys wandered the corridors late at night, remembering how, as a tiny child, she had run through those halls, chasing a ball, or sitting in her mother's lap while ladies-in-waiting gossiped. The ghosts of the past walked beside her. She wondered whether her mother's presence still lingered in these walls, a silent memory of the Dornish princess who had once been forced to watch her father's madness unravel the realm. She found herself in her old nursery one evening. The door was warped with age. No one had used the room in years. Inside, dust coated the furniture and cobwebs draped a wooden rocking horse. The crib where her brother Aegon had slept was gone. Or perhaps it was the same crib, half demolished in a corner. Her footsteps echoed. She recalled a faint memory of her mother humming a lullaby in soft tones. It overwhelmed her, so she sank to her knees, running her hand over the cold floor. Tears slid down her cheeks, silent. Everything that had been destroyed, undone by hatred and ambition, now weighed on her. She whispered into the stillness, "I'm home, Mother. We're home. I hope that's enough." The next day, she and Aegon convened a council in the small council chamber. The carved wooden chairs around the table were chipped, the paint flaking, but the space still carried an air of importance. Barristan Selmy stood by the door, recloaked in white. Aegon had restored him to the King's Guard. Beside him was a Stormlander knight, with newly minted white attire, young, but reputedly honorable. Oberyn Martell lounged in a seat near the center, exuding restless energy. Jon Connington was there too, as Aegon's hand in all but name. A handful of other captains and advisors ringed the table, representing the Golden Company, the Dornish forces, and some Stormlander lords who had supported the invasion. Varys was absent, nowhere to be found, a typical vanishing act from the Spider, though Rhaenys wondered if he lurked in the shadows, listening. Aegon began by addressing the urgent question of the realm's stability. Robert's armies have scattered, but Tywin Lannister remains a threat in the west. The Crownlands are ours, for the most part, but we must secure the support of the other great houses. If the Tyrells and the Starks declare against us, the realm will drown in another war. Oberyn nodded sharply. Dorne stands behind you, of course, and the Stormlands are largely in your control. But the Reach is a question. Mace Tyrell has always coveted closeness to the crown. If we can show him it is in his interest to support you, he might abandon the Lannisters. Otherwise, he might side with them, or fancy himself an independent power. Rhaenys studied the map laid out on the table. What of the north? The Starks were Robert's staunch allies, but Eddard Stark is a man of honor, from all I've heard. He despised the injustice done to our mother and brother. Perhaps he might see reason, especially with Robert's defeat. He has no personal love for the Lannisters. Jon Connington pressed his lips together, his eyes flicking over the map. The key might be to confirm that we will not punish the North for their role in Robert's rebellion, provided they bend the knee now. Stark lost members of his family in that conflict too. Brandon and Rickard at the hands of Aerys. That wound might never fully heal, but we can offer him an honorable path. If we threaten vengeance, he will resist. Aegon turned to the others. And the Vale. Lord Robert Arryn is still a boy, with Lady Lysa Tully controlling him. She is flighty and seems to have no love for the Lannisters either, but also no great affection for Targaryens. The Vale might remain neutral if left alone, or it might see an opportunity to expand its influence. We should dispatch envoys with care. No. They debated for hours. Rhaenys listened, occasionally leaning in to trace routes on the map. She urged a balanced approach. They should neither appear weak nor replicate the cruelty of Rhaenys. The realm must be courted through diplomacy, she argued. They had demonstrated their martial power on the battlefield already. Now they must show they could govern. The discussion shifted eventually to the fate of Robert, of how to handle his trial. Oberyn suggested simply beheading him. Connington suggested a formal trial by a panel of lords, which might legitimize the Targaryen regime in the eyes of the realm. Aegon seemed torn, glancing often at Rhaenys. She spoke carefully. If we hold a public trial, we risk giving him a platform to speak against us. He is charismatic, especially when rousing men to action. But if we kill him without trial, it looks like tyranny. We might feed in the same old fears that the Targaryens are as cruel as Rhaenys. We should show we have nothing to hide. Let the lords judge Robert's crimes. But we must ensure that the truth of Elia and her children is laid bare, so that no one can deny the injustice that was done. Nay. Aegon nodded. Very well. We will convene a great council here in King's Landing. We will invite the great houses to attend. Tyrell, Stark, Arryn, Greyjoy, Tully, perhaps even a representative from the Westerlands. If Tywin is willing to send one, let them see Robert's trial with their own eyes. Let them witness that House Targaryen does not rule by fear alone. A flicker of uncertainty passed through the room. They all knew Tywin might refuse any invitation, or he might send some untrustworthy agent. He might also gather forces to strike while King's Landing was still adjusting to the new regime. But they had to start somewhere. As soon as the council dispersed, ravens were sent out across the 7 kingdoms. Messengers bore identical letters to Winterfell, to the Eyrie, to Riverrun, to Highgarden, to Pike, to Casterly Rock. The letters declared that King Aegon VI Targaryen and Princess Rhaenys Targaryen had seized the capital, and that a grand council would be held to judge Robert Baratheon. Peace and pardon were promised to any lord who came and bent the knee in good faith. In the weeks that followed, King's Landing slowly adapted to the new rule. The small folk had expected more chaos, but the city's markets reopened, and taxes were lowered slightly to encourage commerce. Dornish patrols replaced the gold cloaks, though the new King's Guard was re-establishing itself, absorbing men who had once served under Robert or prior Targaryen kings. Rhaenys made a point of visiting the Street of Flower, the Street of Silk, and other major districts, escorted by Oberyn and a small retinue. There, she spoke with bakers, weavers, carpenters, hearing their concerns. Many flinched in her presence, uncertain of her intentions, but word spread that the Targaryen princess was not as aloof as Rhaenys had been, nor as indifferent as Robert. Sometimes she thought of Viserys and Daenerys, the other Targaryens across the sea. Rumor said Viserys had crowned himself in exile, naming Daenerys his sister as a bargaining chip for a Dothraki warlord. If the rumors were true, Daenerys had become Khaleesi, riding with the horse lords across the plains of Essos. Rhaenys wondered how they would react to news that Aegon and Rhaenys had reclaimed King's Landing. Would Viserys resent them for taking his throne, or would he kneel? It was a strange twist of fate that while Viserys had claimed the mantle of the last dragon for years, the realm now bowed to different Targaryens entirely. A month went by, and the castle gradually settled into a routine under new leadership. Robert Baratheon remained in a tower cell, guarded day and night. Cersei Lannister and her children were confined to Maegor's Holdfast, with enough comforts to keep them quiet, but under constant watch. Joffrey was just old enough to glower at the guards. Myrcella and Tommen were younger, frightened more than anything. On a few occasions, Cersei demanded to speak with the king, threatening dire consequences if harm came to her children, but Aegon had her pleas politely ignored for the time being. The question of what to do with Robert's children, Joffrey, Myrcella, Tommen, and even the rumored bastard Gendry, remained unresolved. Some counselors suggested that letting them live would invite future rebellions, but Rhaenys remembered her own childhood terror. She refused to see children punished for the sins of their parents. At last, ravens began to arrive with responses. Some lords wrote that they would attend the Great Council. Others were non-committal. Tywin Lannister's letter was curt. He refused to recognize Aegon as king, denouncing the council as a false spectacle. He did not promise war, but his words hinted that any aggression toward Lannister interests would be repaid in blood. From Winterfell came a more measured missive. Lord Eddard Stark stated he would journey south to see for himself the truth of these living Targaryen heirs. From Highgarden came a promise that Mace Tyrell would come as well, though he couched it in grandiose language about preserving the safety of the realm. The Vale sent a short acceptance from Lady Lysa, though it was overshadowed by a separate private note from Petyr Baelish, who promised potential support if certain favors were granted. Baelish's name had been spoken of in hushes. He had once been Master of Coin for King Robert, but rumor said he fled the city before the Targaryens took it. Some suspected he might appear again when it was politically convenient. Rhaenys and Aegon both knew that this council would be a pivotal moment. If they could gain the allegiance, or at least neutrality, of the major houses, the war might end swiftly. If not, open conflict would reign. To bolster their position, they strengthened the city's defenses and quietly negotiated with the Iron Bank of Braavos to secure loans, should they be needed. The royal treasury, once mismanaged by Robert, was nearly bankrupt, which alarmed everyone. A new master of coin was needed, but no one suitable had emerged yet. Varys still flitted about the shadows, offering cryptic counsel from time to time but never revealing his full hand. He seemed content that the Targaryens had claimed the throne at last, though Rhaenys wondered what deeper motivations drove him. As the date for the council neared, wagons and retinues began to file into King's Landing from all corners of the realm. Lysa Arryn sent a small party of knights, but she herself did not travel, using her son's ill health as an excuse. Eddard Stark arrived in person accompanied by his wife Catelyn Tully and a score of northern bannermen. His face was grim when he rode through the city gates, the direwolf of House Stark snapping in the wind. People gawked at the quiet wolf of the north, whose name had once been revered as Robert's brother-in-arms. Rhaenys watched from a balcony as Stark's party entered the Red Keep's courtyard. She'd heard stories of the man's honor, how he had tried to protect her mother when the war ended. He had refused to condone the murders of Rhaenys' family. It was said he had quarreled fiercely with King Robert and Tywin Lannister over that very matter, though he never overcame the power they held. Now, if rumor was correct, he had tried to live quietly in the north, raising his children. Rhaenys wondered if he came in peace, or if he harbored some hidden loyalty to Robert. She descended to the courtyard, accompanied by Jon Connington and a handful of guards. Eddard Stark dismounted, removing his gloves. His face was stern, etched by years of wind and cold, but not unkind. The moment he saw her, something flickered in his expression, recognition of the living ghost. He bowed his head. "Princess Rhaenys." "Lord Stark," she replied, inclining her head with poise. "Welcome to King's Landing." "I had heard you were alive," he said quietly, searching her face. "Yet seeing you in the flesh is remarkable." He glanced to Aegon, who descended the steps behind her. For an instant, she saw a flicker of memory in Stark's eyes, the silhouette of Rhaegar, perhaps, or the swirl of events that ended at the Trident. "Your Grace," he said, addressing Aegon with careful formality. "I come as requested, to witness the trial you propose." Aegon acknowledged him with a slight nod, tension clear in his stance. "We are grateful you have come in peace. We remember the loyalty you once showed my father, and we also remember your refusal to sanction the murder of Princess Elia and her children." Stark's lips pressed together. "That day remains a stain on the honor of the realm. If I had had the power, I would have seen justice done then. Perhaps it is late, but I hope justice may yet prevail." Rhaenys caught the slight tremor in the Northman's voice, regret, or perhaps relief. She gestured for them to enter. "We will do all we can to see that justice is served fairly. Our war is with those who sanctioned the killing of innocents, not with the North, if the North does not raise arms against us." Stark inclined his head in acceptance. His wife, Lady Catelyn, stood behind him, silent but watchful, her auburn hair tied back neatly. Rhaenys greeted her politely, noticing the way Lady Catelyn's gaze swept over the Dornish guards. The Targaryen presence in the Red Keep was still unsettling to those who had spent years under Baratheon rule. But so far, no swords were drawn. The tension remained, though, thick as the humidity in the summer air. Over the next few days, more arrivals poured in. Mace Tyrell entered with pomp and ceremony, trailing knights in shining armor and ladies in extravagant gowns. He made a show of bowing low to Aegon and Rhaenys, though one could sense he was feeling out the new power dynamic. In conversation, Tyrell boasted of Highgarden's wealth, spoke vaguely of new alliances, and flattered Rhaenys by praising her radiant presence. She saw through his sycophancy but returned polite smiles. She knew Highgarden's support was crucial for a stable realm. The Reach's armies were massive, and its harvests fed half the continent. If Mace Tyrell could be won over with honors and titles, perhaps war in the south and west could be avoided. The most conspicuous absence was House Lannister. Tywin had not come, nor had Jaime or any other high-ranking Lannister. A single lesser cousin appeared, serving as the Westerland's nominal representative, Damian Lannister, a nephew or second cousin to Tywin. He arrived with a face as stiff as carved stone, offering only a minimal nod to the Targaryens. "I bring Lord Tywin's regrets," Damian said, voice dripping with cold courtesy. "He is preoccupied with events in the west. I come only to observe on his behalf." Neither Aegon nor Rhaenys were fooled. Tywin was keeping his distance, biding his time. Representatives from the Iron Islands were even less cordial. Lord Balon Greyjoy did not appear at all. Instead, he sent his brother Victarion, a brute of a man who arrived wearing salt-stained armor and a scowl. Victarion wasted no time proclaiming that the Ironborn cared little for the affairs of mainland kings. He reminded them that the Iron Islands had declared independence once before, and could do so again if pressed. Rhaenys, mindful of how a united front was essential, resolved to tread carefully. The Ironborn were a vexing puzzle. From the Riverlands, Lord Hoster Tully was bedridden with illness, so Edmure Tully came in his place, accompanied by Sir Brynden, Blackfish Tully. Their presence was more cordial. Edmure was good-natured, if somewhat uncertain, and the Blackfish observed everything with a keen eye. The Tullys had lost a great deal in Robert's rebellion as well, but they'd benefited from alliances with the Baratheons and Starks. Now they stood at a crossroads. On the appointed morning of the council, the throne room filled with lords, ladies, and sworn swords. Guards lined the walls. Aegon sat on the Iron Throne, and Rhaenys stood beside him on the dais. Ned Stark, Mace Tyrell, Edmure Tully, and the other great and lesser lords found seats arranged in a semicircle. Damian Lannister glowered from his place, flanked by a pair of Westerland's knights. Victarion Greyjoy slouched with arms folded as though bored. Oberyn Martell hovered near the dais, uncharacteristically silent. The hush that settled was akin to a collective holding of breath. They brought Robert Baratheon into the hall, still bound but with his ropes loosened enough to allow him some dignity. He had been given clean clothes, though the bruises on his face and arms had not fully healed. His eyes flicked over the assembled lords, and for a moment he seemed almost resigned. He must have noted that his old friend Ned Stark was here, that Tywin was not, that the Targaryens commanded the center of attention. A cleric from the faith was present to oversee the formalities. He stepped forward, announcing in a shaky voice that the council was convened to hear the charges against Robert Baratheon. Treason against the rightful Targaryen king, the killing and conspiracy to kill members of House Targaryen, and the subsequent misrule of the realm. He also made mention of the horrors inflicted upon the Princess Elia Martell and her children, which were laid at Robert's feet by virtue of his condoning the men who committed the crimes. The old man's voice wavered, but the words rang out through the throne room, causing many to shift uncomfortably in their seats. Robert stood with chains rattling and said in a hoarse tone, "I do not deny I fought against the Mad King's rule. I make no apologies for that. As for the murder of Elia and her children, I never ordered such a thing, nor did I celebrate it." Oberyn let out a snarl. "You rewarded the Lannisters with wealth and titles. You let that monster Gregor Clegane roam free." His voice trembled with barely contained rage. "You sat on the throne they handed you after they bought it with the blood of Elia and her babes." Robert's face contorted. "Aerys had to be removed. And your Prince Rhaegar, he brought war upon the realm by stealing away Lyanna Stark, or have you forgotten? I avenged that crime. The rest was Tywin's doing, not mine." Nentall. A wave of murmurs passed through the assembled lords. Some nodded at the mention of Lyanna Stark, recalling the old rumor that Rhaegar had abducted her. Ned Stark stirred, tension playing across his rigid features. He said nothing yet, but Rhaenys saw how the mention of Lyanna pained him. She felt a pang of sympathy, suspecting that the truth might be far more complicated. She recalled vague whispers that her father had believed Lyanna was his true love, or that they had wed in secret. But that had never been confirmed in the open, and the realm believed whatever fueled their hatred. Mace Tyrell cleared his throat. The question before us is not whether Aerys was mad, or whether Rhaegar did this or that. It is whether House Targaryen is the rightful monarchy. The rebellion unseated them, yes, but the child murders, if proven, were an unspeakable crime. And now that living Targaryens stand before us, do we not owe them fealty by the ancient laws of inheritance? Damian Lannister scoffed. The Lannisters recognized Robert as king. Are we to condemn our entire house for that? Oberyn's glare swung to him. For your role in slaughtering innocents, 1,000 times yes. You think we forget Gregor Clegane and Amory Lorch, who wore your lion as they did the deed. Damian's complexion reddened. They were not commanded by my lord. Aegon's voice cut through sharply. Enough. The actions of your house will be judged in time. This council is for Robert Baratheon's trial. He leaned forward on the throne, posture taut at taut. Robert, you stand accused of usurping the throne that belonged to my grandfather, and you can hide behind Tywin Lannister all you like, but you sat that throne. You reigned 20-odd years while the memory of my mother's butchery went unpunished. Will you take responsibility for that? Robert's jaw worked. He glanced around as though seeking an ally, but found only hard stares. Even Ned Stark watched him with regret, not with the old camaraderie that might have once existed. At last, Robert said, if you mean to kill me for that, then get on with it. I will not grovel. I will not beg. Silence stretched. Rhaenys cast her gaze across the hall, reading the mood. Many of these lords might prefer a swift beheading, if only to rid the realm of uncertainty. Some, like Oberyn, desired vengeance. Others worried about the precedent of punishing a deposed king so harshly. What if the realm saw it as a sign that the Targaryens would never forgive? Ned Stark rose to his feet slowly. All eyes turned to him. His dark gray cloak fell around him like wolf's fur. Robert, he said, voice quiet yet resonant. I stood beside you in the rebellion. I believed Rhaegar Targaryen had wronged my sister. But I never condoned the murder of children. Nor did I believe the realm would be given over to men who would do such things. We parted ways when you allowed Tywin Lannister to shield his knights from justice. Robert stared at him with something close to betrayal in his eyes. You speak as though I had a choice. Without Tywin's support, our rebellion would have failed. Stark's mouth tightened. Then you must bear the burden of that choice. As king, you had the power to punish criminals, but you let them be your bedfellows. I cannot stand by you now. The hush that followed was absolute. Robert's shoulders sagged, the fight seemingly draining from him. Rhaenys watched the interplay with an odd sense of pity. Once, Robert had been unstoppable, beloved by many. Now here he was, forced to confront the monstrous price of his victory. Aegon cleared his throat, the metal of the throne scraping as he shifted. We offer you a choice, Robert Baratheon, he said, his tone cold and formal. You may confess to having wrongfully taken the throne, to having condoned or overlooked the atrocities that placed you there. We will show you mercy if you take the black and join the Night's Watch, or if you will not. If you refuse to acknowledge the crimes that stained your reign, we will have your head. A ripple of shock coursed through the onlookers. Take the black. Exile to the wall, an offer of life, but a bitter one for a man once called king. Rhaenys, standing at Aegon's side, said nothing but watched Robert's reaction intently. A hush descended, broken only by the whisper of cloth and the clank of a distant guard's armor. Robert's eye flashed. Confess? Kneel? You think me a coward? Ned Stark's voice carried a note of grim persuasion. Robert, don't be a fool. This is your chance to spare the realm more bloodshed. If you refuse, your death will spark more war. Your banners may rally around your memory. The best thing you can do is yield, so the realm can heal. Robert bared his teeth. I'll never kneel to Targaryens. Not after what their line did to the realm. I'd sooner die on my feet. Whoa. Rhaenys felt her chest tighten. She had anticipated this, though part of her had hoped Robert might choose the black. Mercy might help quell the bitterness that still clung to this war. But it appeared Robert would not allow it. She looked to Aegon, whose face was pale with tension. He turned to the gathered lords, voice echoing. You have all heard his refusal. He will not yield, nor atone. By the authority of the crown and this council, Robert Baratheon is hereby sentenced to die. No outcry came. Even Mace Tyrell, known for bluster, seemed muted. Damian Lannister looked uneasy, but he said nothing, glancing at the floor. Victarion Greyjoy had an expression of utter indifference. Stark's face was a mask of sorrow, but he did not protest. The fate was sealed. Robert exhaled, a shaky sound that might have been relief or fear. Then, he straightened to his full height and let his chains fall slack. Then do it. I don't want any fancy speech or ceremony. If you Targaryens have any shred of honor, do it yourself instead of letting a headsman do your dirty work. A tension like a drawn bowstring snapped through the hall. Rhaenys felt her pulse roaring in her ears. She knew there would be no turning back after this. If they executed a crowned king, albeit a deposed one, before the entire realm, it would send a message that House Targaryen's restoration was absolute. But it also risked it deepening the scars of the war. She wondered if there was any other path. Aegon stood. So be it. He looked at Rhaenys. In his eyes she read a desperate question. Should I do this? Should you? She recalled her father's teachings about mercy, about the monarchy's duty to bear responsibility themselves. A memory flickered of old tales about how the Starks of the North carried out their own executions. He who passes the sentence swings the sword. Rhaenys had never done such a thing, but she knew if Aegon shrank from it, it might undermine him in the eyes of these lords. Slowly, Aegon descended from the throne. Guards parted to make space. Robert was forced to kneel, though he resisted until forced physically, and his head was pushed forward. The tension in the air was so thick, Rhaenys felt she could barely breathe. Aegon unsheathed a Valyrian steel blade, a sword recovered from the vaults, once belonging to House Targaryen. The metal caught the torchlight with a cruel gleam. He paused, glancing at Robert. The battered man stared straight ahead, jaw set. Rhaenys thought she saw a flicker of old memories pass through Robert's eyes. His youth, his glory, all undone. She remembered how he had bellowed on the battlefield, calling for Targaryen blood. Now, in a cruel twist, he was the one kneeling, about to pay for the sins that had placed him on the throne. Aegon lifted the blade. Silence reigned. Then, in a single sharp stroke, he brought it down. The hiss of steel and the thud of the blow echoed across the hall. Robert Baratheon's head fell forward, severed cleanly, blood splattering across the polished floor. Gasps flitted through the assembled lords and some averted their eyes. A moment later, a guard wrapped the body in a cloth, moving briskly. Robert's lifeless face stared blankly at the far wall, as though in shock at its own demise. Rhaenys closed her eyes, fighting a wave of nausea. So many times, she had pictured retribution for what had been done to her family. Yet the reality of it was cold and harsh. Robert's blood on the floor did not bring her mother back, nor her baby brother. It did not undo the past. And she could see from Aegon's pallor that he felt the weight of his deed. He stood, sword dripping, breathing raggedly. A hush wrapped the throne room like a shroud. Then Aegon straightened, turning to face the lords. Robert Baratheon is dead, he said, his voice resonating off the stone columns. With that, the war he began is ended, if you choose it to be. Let any lord who still defies House Targaryen step forward now, or bend the knee and help us rebuild a realm that has seen too much bloodshed already. None, ne'er sent Sal. One by one, the lords in attendance stood, then dropped to their knees, heads bowed. Mace Tyrell, Edmure Tully, even Damian Lannister, though grudgingly. Victarion Greyjoy lowered himself last, and Stark was neither the first nor the last, but he did kneel, solemn and silent. A part of Rhaenys felt relief at the sight. Another part felt only sadness. A new chapter was beginning, and it was drenched in the blood of the old. When it was done, guards discreetly removed Robert's body. Servants rushed to mop the floor. The lords rose, and Aegon sheathed the sword, though his hand trembled on the hilt. The formal session ended, the lords dispersing in uneasy murmurs. Rhaenys lingered near the throne, gaze drifting to the empty spot where Robert had knelt. Would this truly bring peace, or would it light the fires of vengeance in others? As the hall cleared, Ned Stark approached. He moved with a slow, deliberate gait, as though each step was weighed. He stopped before Rhaenys, his gray eyes heavy with unspoken things. "Princess," he said quietly, "I pray that your rule will not demand such violence again." She met his gaze, unsure what to say. "You disapprove." He shook his head, frowning. "Robert gave you no choice. A man who will not yield invites the sword. Still, I do not relish seeing an old friend die that way." His voice was thick with grief. "But that is the price of war." She nodded. "We do what we must for the realm. I regret that it came to this." Stark studied her a moment longer, then said, "I will remain in the city a short while longer. My wife's kin, the Tullys, wish to discuss the new order. After that, I must return to Winterfell. I have a family of my own who need me." He hesitated, then added, "But if the king wills it, I will acknowledge House Targaryen as the rightful rulers, provided you keep your promise of justice and peace." Rhaenys inclined her head. "We will. You have my word, Lord Stark." He exhaled, relieved, and retreated from the dais. Rhaenys felt a complex swirl of emotions. She looked to Aegon, who stood with Jon Connington and Oberyn Martell. Aegon's face was drawn, as though weighed by a burden that might never lift. Their eyes met. She gave him a small nod of understanding. In that moment, she understood that his heart bled too, that he had not wanted to kill Robert any more than she had. Yet the demands of kingship were cruel. As the sun dipped below the horizon, King's Landing vibrated with tension. The news of Robert's execution spread like wildfire. Some among the small folk cheered, recalling the times Robert's neglect had led to hunger, or the times the gold cloaks had run amok. Others cursed the Targaryens as kinslayers, usurpers themselves. Still others merely shrugged. One king was the same as another, so long as they could put bread on the table. Meanwhile, the lords who had witnessed the trial and execution departed with renewed clarity about House Targaryen's power. For the moment, no one dared challenge them openly. But the realms beyond King's Landing were vast. Word would reach the Westerlands soon enough. How would Tywin react? Would he gather an army to march on the capital, or would he bide his time, plotting some cunning move from Casterly Rock? Would the Tyrells remain steadfast if war resumed? Would the North truly stay loyal, or might something else inflame them? Old grudges, new slights. The puzzle remained unfinished, the fate of the realm uncertain. Rhaenys found herself in the Godswood that night, alone, except for 2 distant guards. The Red Keep's Godswood was modest compared to Winterfell's, but it offered a semblance of peace. A slender weirwood stood at its center, bark white as bone, face carved with ancient eyes that seemed to stare into the depths of her soul. She sat on a stone bench, her arms wrapped around herself. In the hush, she could almost feel the swirling of ghosts, Eris's mania, Rhaegar's misguided dreams, Elias' final pleas. Footsteps crunched on the gravel path. She glanced up to see Aegon approaching, cloaked in black, his expression grim. She waited for him to speak, but he hesitated. At last he sat beside her, exhaling slowly. "I can still see the look on his face," he said, voice faint. "When I swung the sword, Robert didn't flinch. He just stared." She placed a hand on his shoulder. "He forced your hand, Aegon. He was never going to yield." He rubbed his eyes. "I know. It's just, we spent our lives in hiding, preparing for this day, to take back what was ours. And now that it's happened, I feel empty. Like something is missing." He gave a humorless laugh. "We have the throne. The city is ours. But do you feel triumphant, sister?" Rhaenys looked up at the weirwood's crimson leaves. "No," she admitted. "I feel relief that Robert won't come after us again. But I also feel sorrow for how much blood has been spilled, and fear for what comes next. Holding the throne is harder than taking it, or so they say." Hars. Aegon nodded, the tension in his posture undiminished. "I keep thinking of our father, Rhaegar. He believed in prophecy, in some grand design. Was this his design, that his children would retake the throne amid so much death? Or did he want something else entirely? Sometimes I fear we are repeating the errors of the past, forging the same chains that bound him." She squeezed his shoulder, understanding the depth of his conflict. Their father's legacy was a complicated one. Rhaegar had been idealized by some, demonized by others. He had left King's Landing vulnerable when he rode off to the Trident, and thousands died as a result. Rhaenys too had once idolized him, but she had come to learn he was as flawed as any man. "We can't know what father intended," she said softly. "We only know what we believe is right. We must rule better than Aerys and Robert. We must protect the realm, not strangle it." He nodded, then managed a thin smile. "You speak like a queen. Perhaps that is what we need." The word stirred something in her, and she wondered how the realm would react if Aegon crowned her as co-ruler. 2 Targaryens on the throne? It was not unheard of in ancient Valyria for siblings to share power, but Westeros had seldom seen such a thing. She suspected, though, that the great lords might resist the idea. They were used to a single king. The details could wait until the realm was stable, at least. They sat in silence for a long moment, listening to the distant hum of the city below. At length, Aegon sighed. "Tomorrow, we'll begin working on the realm's finances. Connington says the treasury is nearly empty thanks to Robert's lavish spending. We need gold to pay the Golden Company, to rebuild roads and storehouses for winter. There is so much to do." "Oh, me." Rhaenys nodded, drawing a ragged breath. "We'll find a way. We have to. The realm depends on it. And eventually we must address Tywin and the Lannisters directly. They cannot be allowed to remain a threat forever." He agreed with a weary nod. "We should meet them with more than swords. There might be a marriage alliance we could broker, although I loathe to reward Tywin in any way. But perhaps there's another path. If not, war will come again." Nay. They parted ways under the watchful eyes of the weirwood. That night, Rhaenys could barely sleep. She rose at dawn, used to the swirl of uneasy dreams that haunted her. She walked the Red Keep's battlements, feeling the wind from the Blackwater Bay on her face. In the harbor, warships with Targaryen insignia bobbed on the waves, refitted from Robert's old fleet. Merchant vessels came and went, bearing goods from Essos, from Dorne, from the narrow sea isles. Throughout the day, she joined Aegon in receiving lords who offered their fealty. She was mindful of Tyrell's flattery, careful with Edmure Tully's cautious acceptance, appreciative of Ned Stark's quiet cooperation. The Greyjoy envoy gave them little but grunts and vague threats of independence. Aegon, in a measured tone, told Victarion Greyjoy that the Iron Islands would remain part of the Seven Kingdoms unless they wished to face overwhelming force. That statement passed unchallenged for now. When the lords departed, a semblance of calm settled on King's Landing. Rhaenys knew it was a fragile calm. The capital itself was mostly under control. The Crownland's lesser lords had seen which way the wind was blowing, but the rest of Westeros was far from pacified. Indeed, messengers from the west brought rumors that Tywin Lannister was summoning bannermen, reinforcing the walls of Casterly Rock. Jaime Lannister, the Kingslayer, was supposedly leading a contingent of knights near the Gold Road. Was he preparing to march on the capital, or simply defending Lannister territory? No one knew for certain. Over the following weeks, Rhaenys found herself overseeing the city's day-to-day governance while Aegon held court. She dealt with disputes among merchants, oversaw the distribution of food in Flea Bottom, and listened to the pleas of minor lords. It was draining work, but oddly grounding. She realized that this was what her mother, Aelia Martell, might have done had she become queen, forging alliances, caring for the poor, giving a voice to those who had none. Each time Rhaenys stood in the courtyard or walked the streets, people looked at her with wary eyes, half wondering if the Targaryens would revert to cruelty at the slightest provocation. She answered with measured justice, hoping to prove that times had changed.